What is risk parity, and how can we use it to craft our portfolios to boost our safe withdrawal rate from 4% to 5%? Here we go. Welcome to the Forget About Money podcast, where we encourage you to take action today so that you can focus on what matters most to you. Today, our guest is Frank Vasquez, a former attorney and current financial podcaster as the voice behind Risk Parity Radio. With decades of experience in finance and a deep understanding of portfolio management, Frank's here to guide us through risk parity, the essentials of building a balanced, resilient investment strategy, and how we can use that in our own retirement. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Frank, today we're going to discuss risk parity, covering its core concepts and differences from traditional diversification, practical implementation with tools like ETFs and mutual funds, and how this strategy can support your path to financial independence and retirement planning. So why don't we start with risk parity? It's a term that until just a few days ago, I somehow avoided seeing ever on a blog or a podcast. It was very interesting because we hear about diversification all the time, but I didn't know this term risk parity. So can you start by defining what risk parity means in the context of portfolio management, and how does it differ from traditional portfolio diversification strategies?
Risk parity is a diversification strategy that was pioneered by Ray Dalio about 3 decades ago. And it started to be written about by academics and people in the hedge fund field about 20 years ago, and has developed from there. And now it is part of the core curriculum. If you get a CFA, there's a chapter on risk parity. What the original concept that Dalio was looking at is, how do we balance a set of assets based on essentially how risky or volatile they are? And that was the original core concept, is not just taking, say, a 60-40 portfolio, but modifying that and really looking at, well, what are the fundamental risk characteristics of each of these assets? And then how can we balance them in a portfolio? What I've done with it is a little bit different, because the original concept and how hedge funds use this is they construct this balanced risk portfolio and then add leverage to it. And that was the concept. That's what Bridgewater is actually doing with this thing. For do-it-yourself investors, it made much more sense to not focus on levering up a very conservative portfolio, but modifying that with those principles of diversification, with the goal that I have is to maximize the safe withdrawal rate. So I've taken that concept and modified it slightly. What we refer to a lot in my podcast is called the Holy Grail principle, which comes from Ray Dalio. And there's a nice little video where he explains it. And that is applying the principles that Harry Markowitz first developed back in the 1960s about uncorrelated assets and diversification, because that is the only free lunch that you can get in portfolio construction, is using diversification to lower risk without lowering your returns, at least not too much.
Right now, we're talking about diversification under the umbrella of risk parity, I think. So, but what is the difference? So like we hear about diversification. So it's like, okay, do I have a REIT for real estate? Do I have a broad market index fund for equity? Do I have bonds? So to me, that's the first diversification. And of course, each of those has risk, but you're saying risk parity is a way to look at portfolio construct based on the risk profiles of each of those, not necessarily just having your assets across a bunch of different things. That's diversification.
Sort of the classic concept was to not only look at just the differences between the assets, but looking at, well, how risky is, say, a bond compared to a stock? And let's put more bonds in than stocks into this portfolio so we can balance out the risk characteristics, and do that with all of the assets involved. So it's a subset of the broader topic of diversification. And the most meaningful part of this approach really is looking fundamentally, though, at those correlations between the assets. And that holy grail principle that Dalio talks about is look at the actual correlations between your assets and try to find, he talks about finding 15 uncorrelated assets. I think if you can come up with 4 or 5, that's about as good as a do-it-yourself investor is probably going to do. But it's definitely something we can do and something we do. And that's how we develop a portfolio in particular to maximize the safe withdrawal rate is the goal that I have.
Okay. So if we're part of the financial independence community and JL Collins promotes put everything in VTSEX or a low cost broad market index fund equivalent VTSEX kind of thing. And then at some point, maybe consider bonds. I mean, that's kind of like the broad guiding principle of most people in the financial independence community, I would say, or at least that's what's being promoted, and for good reason. So how would you describe the risk parity of a portfolio like that? And then is that the ideal when talking about risk parity and maximizing your safe withdrawal rate?
Yeah, no, that's a very simple portfolio. It's the kind of thing that Bill Bengen was working with when he first did the safe withdrawal rate research back in the 1990s. What you'll see from that, depending on which kinds of stocks and which kinds of bonds you're using, there's various correlations going on there because different kinds of bonds have a different correlation to the stock market. But that is sort of the beginning of this concept. Where this matters is when you're talking about decumulation in a portfolio. If you are accumulating, you don't care very much about the volatility of the portfolio because you're not taking any money out of it. You're putting money into it. When you start taking money out of a portfolio, you start caring more about the overall volatility of the portfolio. And that overall volatility is influenced heavily by the mixture of assets you have in there and their correlations between each other.
Okay, so you bring up a good point, accumulation versus decumulation. So is risk parity something we should be worried about in the accumulation phase? Because you're saying this is a strategy used by hedge fund managers. And I'm assuming that people who invest with hedge fund managers want growth or accumulation, and that's the primary goal. Is it something we should just worry about during accumulation phase or both phases of decumulation and accumulation?
It's really something for decumulation. Speaking about hedge fund managers, they actually do all sorts of things because a lot of the money that they often manage is pension money. So they're not generally talking about accumulating. They're generally talking about having a stable portfolio that generates significant or sufficient growth to allow for distributions to be made. So yes, this concept, how I got to it was trying to figure out what kind of portfolio I wanted to hold in retirement. And so it does not matter that much for accumulation. For accumulation, as long as you can stomach it, 100% stocks over a period of decades is probably going to be the best any amateur is going to do. I would go with what Paul Merriman recommends, which is half S&P 500 or large cap growth and half small cap value. And something like that works really well and works better than a single total market fund, at least historically.
Okay, so with risk parity across a bunch of different asset classes, you're saying you're looking for the risk. I guess you would want an inverted relationship or inverse relationship between assets, right? I'm thinking like, so what's the basic principle? So like if you said 5 different assets in your mind, what is the correlation between the risk parity of each of those assets and what kind of linkages are you looking at in between each of those?
Well, you are looking at correlation numbers, first of all. Correlations are measured with a number that is between -1 and 1. And so in order to calculate them, you take whatever data you have about these asset classes, put it into a calculator, and there are plenty of them out there. You can go to Portfolio Visualizer and find one. And that will tell you whether 2 assets are highly correlated, that are moving in the same direction at the same time. They have a 0 correlation, which means they move kind of randomly without reference to each other, or they have a negative correlation, which is relatively rare, but it does happen. In which case, when one is going up, the other one's going down. And so you take the group of assets, you look at all of the correlations, not only because there's obviously multiple pairings you're talking about if you're having multiple assets in a portfolio. All of this can be analyzed to determine what is a safe withdrawal rate that comes out of that, either historically or through a Monte Carlo simulation. And so that is ultimately what you're looking at. What you find is that when you combine very uncorrelated assets, you get higher safe withdrawal rates. And when you combine very highly correlated assets, you get lower safe withdrawal rates. This research actually goes back to Bengen's original research, where he found, just using those two assets, stocks and bonds, that if you went all the way bonds or all the way stocks, the safe withdrawal rate went lower. And so it was looking at the mixture between the two of them that gave you a higher safe withdrawal rate that got over that original 4%. Whereas if you were to hold, say, 100% stocks in retirement, your safe withdrawal rate's only about 3.4%. And that's sort of the starting point. And then as you add other assets, you can improve the safe withdrawal rate. But it's one of these things where you can't just look at a set of assets and guess what it is. You actually have to put them together and run some kind of analysis, usually a Monte Carlo simulation, but you can also do the historical simulation to make that determination.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into more how to increase the safe withdrawal rate in a few minutes. Like, can you give an example, 5 assets and how they correlate to each other? Like, I'm just trying to get the listener some idea if they have different assets in their portfolio, do they have some of these, and what's the chances that they actually, how do they correlate to each other regarding risk parity?
Okay, yeah. So if you take an asset like the stock market, and say let's start with just an S&P 500 fund. Now, there are parts of the stock market that are less correlated to that than others. So if you are to take, say, small cap value and pair it up, those two things they're positively correlated. All stocks are positively correlated, but they have a lower correlation than just the large cap fund or a bunch of large cap funds. Other parts of the stock market sector-wise are also show lower correlations, such as REITs, such as utilities, such as groups of insurance companies have a lower correlation to the overall market. So you can look at those kind of subsets just in the stock market. Now you take that and then you take an asset like treasury bonds. Treasury bonds have the lowest correlation of any kind of bond to stocks. And so if you're looking at a bunch of different kinds of bonds going from all the way from junk corporates to treasuries, you will find that looking at these correlation numbers, treasuries have the lowest correlation to those things. If you add then something like an alternative asset like gold, that has a zero correlation to both stocks and bonds. So that can fit into there like that. You can construct a portfolio with just those 3 things that has a higher safe withdrawal rate.
You said 3 things, but we talked about REITs, utilities, S&P.
Well, those are all part of the stock market.
Okay.
So those are essentially sub-asset classes of the stock market. They are all going to be positively correlated, but some less positively correlated than other groupings. So the 3, from a macro allocation perspective, those are 3 asset classes, and then you break down the other one into a couple of different ones.
Let's say I'm coming up on retirement and I've just discovered this risk parity, and I'm optimistic because I got Frank Vasquez saying I can take out more money than I originally thought if I do X, Y, and Z with my portfolio. What are some tools out there that I can use, or what kind of actions should I be taking in order to kind of transition what I previously thought was just going to be a strict 4% rule, or plus or minus a percentage or a fraction, and to this new, to me new, this new risk parity idea?
Okay, well, you need to first determine when you have won the game, as Bill Bernstein used to say. And he used to say, well, he still says, when you've won the game, you can stop playing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is telling you when you have accumulated, say, 25 times, that's a good ballpark estimate, a conservative estimate. When you've accumulated in your investments 25 times your expenses, at least the expenses you expect to cover with that, you've won the game as far as that is concerned. At that point, you may not be ready to retire, but you could transition your portfolio to a retirement portfolio, whether that's a risk parity style portfolio or some other portfolio. And you could do that tomorrow. It's usually the best way that I advise people in transition is the best time to do a transition is one, you've won the game or you're very close and can kind of glide in the next few years with just a little bit of growth. And that your current portfolio is at or near an all-time high. And I think that is the danger people get into. They want to stay in that accumulation portfolio all the way up to retirement. That is dangerous because if you have that stock market crash right before you're about to retire, then you have a problem. Whereas if you've already made the transition before you actually retire and have your portfolio all lined up and ready to go, then you can kind of just glide into it. So usually people are looking at this somewhere, I would say 5 years before retirement, but it could be longer if you make it earlier, because I know people that will accumulate in a portfolio like this, knowing that they don't mind it taking longer. They just like the fact that it's a lot less volatile than a typical accumulation portfolio.
That's a great point. And one I don't know that I've ever really thought about is once you've reached enough, whatever that is for you, no matter what your age or no matter what your time horizon is for, officially retiring, once you have enough, go ahead and consider doing that. Even if you wanted to keep working rather than continue to accumulate.
In fact, that's the most sensible thing to do.
Okay.
Because if you're getting more than enough, then you have to be wondering, well, what is the purpose of this? Am I trying to die with the most money? What am I trying to do?
Because and I'm thinking, even practically speaking, let's say you had a time horizon, you decided you're going to work till 50 or 55, and let's say 55, and you get enough, 25x at 50, but you still want to work some more. So even if you were to transition your entire portfolio over into a risk parity portfolio at 50 years old, that next 5 years, you'd probably still see some gains.
It's still going to grow. It's not that it doesn't. It's not that it stops growing. What you'll find is that it grows a little slower, but what you get is a lot less volatility in the portfolios. So it doesn't go down up and down nearly as much.
And if you're still saving, if you're still working and making money for that next 5 years from 50 to 55, then that allows you to sleep well at night too. If you've got $100,000 or more or whatever on your checking account, so
exactly. You want to avoid being either fearful or greedy. And if you are continuing to accumulate when you don't have to anymore in a risky portfolio, that is being greedy. And you want to, that's probably not the right way to approach this if you're thinking about the purpose of your money, to support a life and not just to be more money.
In the financial independence community, many people, they are do-it-yourselfers. They manage their own portfolios. And so this is probably who we're talking to specifically for this podcast audience. However, there's the masses out there too. So if somebody who wasn't a do-it-yourself investor decided, okay, I like what Frank Vasquez is talking about here, I want to do that with my portfolio, but I don't want to manage each asset class. Go in, rebalance, or I don't even know exactly how you would manage that, but do you periodically rebalance? But they just don't want to do all that work. Are there just straight up ETFs or mutual funds that are managed with this principle? And would you advise somebody who doesn't want to manage their own portfolio go that route?
There are such funds, but I would not use them.
Okay.
This is not hard. Uh, we're talking about holding somewhere between 5 and 10 ETFs, setting up, deciding what your allocations are going to be at the beginning, and then just rebalancing them, say, once a year. So in theory, you could be looking at this portfolio once a year and rebalancing it back to its original configuration. But I do want to dispel the idea that what I'm talking about is hard. It's not hard. It's if you can handle a portfolio with a few things in it, and I think most people who are do-it-yourselfers can. This is actually easier than what I see a lot of people doing. Most of my listeners are people like you describe. They have been do-it-yourself investors for quite a while. They are quite successful at it. They have millions of dollars. They are looking for what else is there, and now how can I maximize my use of this money? And so the basics of constructing any portfolio and rebalancing it also apply to these. And we're not trying to, make moves based on what the Fed is doing or anything like that. Mm-hmm. The idea is to what you call naive diversification, in terms of we're going to set up a portfolio with these allocations and these percentages, and then we're going to stick with that. So instead of it being a 60-40 portfolio, it'll be a 20-20-20-20-20 portfolio, or a 42-26-16-10-6. But those allocations that you come up with tell you are most of the management of the whole thing.
I've gone to your website and I've checked it out, and you've got at riskparityradio.com/portfolios, there's a list of portfolios, and I don't pretend to understand all of it, but in general, are there models, risk parity portfolio models that someone can emulate? Somebody's already done all the homework and they can have some basic assumptions, from back testing, how their performance may or may not be and how that affects their safe withdrawal rate. Can you just go through some of those models if that is the case?
Yeah, you'll find these models in various places, and I've really adopted them for the purpose of the website. So the original model, or sort of classic portfolio, is the one that Ray Dalio described to Tony Robbins in Money Master the Game, and that is known as the all seasons or all weather portfolio. And so that is the first one listed there. That, I believe, is too conservative for most people. It only has 30% in stocks in it. But that was the classic risk parity idea. Now, the next one listed on there is called the Golden Butterfly. That comes from a gentleman named Tyler, who runs a very excellent site called Portfolio Charts, where he also has about 19 different portfolios, some of them traditional Boglehead, 60-40, other things. And then he's got some of these risk parity style portfolios, including what he calls the Golden Butterfly, which is 20% in total stock market fund, 20% in small cap value, 20% each in long and short treasury bonds, and the remaining 20% in gold. That one's been out there since 2016. It's funny. Some of these people are sort of original FI people from days. I'm old enough to be pre-Money Mustache, and early retirement extreme is where we all hung out together on that board. And that's where I met Tyler, and I saw when he created this thing in 2016 and this whole website with all of this data. So you could make these things and analyze them and do these sorts of things. So the Golden Butterfly is actually kind of an original FI portfolio, believe it or not. And so I've got another one there I call the Golden Ratio, which is my sort of contribution to this. And then we have some other ones that are more sort of experimental that I've picked up, and some of them have some leverage in them. Those are more just for experimentation, because my audience is very diverse in terms of their preferences and risk tolerance in portfolio construction. And some of them want to use leveraged funds. And so there's a site called Optimized Portfolios, which talks a whole lot about all of those kinds of portfolios. We've got a few of those, but most people really focus on the golden butterfly and golden ratio kind of portfolios at the website, because those are easy to understand, easy to implement. And a lot of the people who have used what we've got there have ultimately adopted something like those kinds of portfolios.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm definitely going to take a closer look at those.
When you look at the description of the portfolio, it tells you where it came from. I didn't invent any of this stuff. I just brought it together. In one place, and I'm using it for this particular purpose of maximizing my safe withdrawal rate in retirement.
So, which brings me to the next question. How do these risk parity portfolios increase or decrease or affect the safe withdrawal rate? And can you state specifically as compared to what we're normally talking about, the 4% rule?
Yeah, they're over 5% is the short answer for things like the golden butterfly and golden ratio. And this is an interesting topic, because if you follow Bill Bengen and his development, I think most people in the FI community think that Bill Bengen's work ended in the 1990s with the 4% rule, and that was the end. That's not true. Bill Bengen continued to develop and showed that if you added more diverse components to portfolios, the last ones he was working with in about 2020, 2021, we're at 4.7 or 4.8%. So this idea that we're somehow stuck with 4% because somebody did some research 30 years ago is false. And what I'm working with is one way to solve that problem or be able to increase your spending.
There are some people who think that the 4% rule is too low. Some people think it's too high. And these are all really smart people. But this is the first time I'm even hearing, which is amazing to me again, that 5% is really where the mark can be with a less risky portfolio. So why is it not being promoted more?
That's an interesting question. And in order to get to it, I have to ask you, what do you think is the actual withdrawal strategy, the primary thing that all of the people you talk to are doing, whether it's J.L. Collins or Paul Merriman or yourself or even Warren Buffett? To me, you all have the same strategy.
Take it when you need it. That's my strategy, probably.
Your strategy is don't spend much money.
Well, that's how you got there, right? But that's not the ideal in retirement.
That is in fact what most guru types in personal finance, and that is what they are actually doing in their personal life. They are taking much less than, say, 3% out of a portfolio. If you are taking 3% or less out of a portfolio, you can do all kinds of things. You can have a portfolio that's 25% stocks, like Bill Bernstein. You can have one that's 80% stocks, like J.L. Collins. You can have 50-50, like Paul Merriman. You can do anything you want. And so what that tells you is that this is in my mind, this is the reason that this has not been explored, because most people in the FI community fundamentally have difficulty spending money, and they're not spending money, and anything works. You don't need to have any special kind of portfolio if you're spending 3% or less. So the first question is, do you want to spend more money? And if you do want to spend more money, that is where you start thinking about, how do I change my portfolio construction? How do I change my withdrawal rules in terms of guideposts or other ways of adjusting your withdrawals over time? But to me, that is, if you're asking, the FI community still lives in a bubble about this. And for a long time, there was almost a bidding war, an unhealthy bidding war in two respects. In accumulation, the unhealthy bidding war is who can have the highest savings rate.
Yeah.
Let's all talk about who can have the highest savings. Oh, I have 50%. Oh, I have 70%. Oh, you're not counting it the right way. Oh,
yeah, true. Yeah.
That same thought process goes on the decumulation side. It's like, well, I'm spending 4%. Well, I can do better than that. I can spend 3%. Well, I'm at 2.5. I'm close to 1. I'm not spending any money at all. If your goal is to not spend money, and what economists would call a revealed preference. A revealed preference is what is the objective, most likely consequence of your action, regardless of what you say you're doing. If you are not spending money, your revealed preference, and this is the preference of a great majority of the FI community, is to die with the most money possible. Because that is the most natural consequence of not spending your money. I never wanted to be in that category, but I have found that one of the big resistances and why people look to anything or cling to anything that sounds more conservative is because fundamentally they don't want to spend their money. They don't want to let go of it. So if they can find an article that says, oh, things are going to be worse in the future because of a CAPE ratio, a lot of people just glom onto that. It's like, oh yeah, that's why I'm only spending 2.5%. And they never bother to ask, is that true? Is that valid? There are a lot of scare articles written about this topic. We are just getting to that point. There was a problem also in the industry itself, the personal finance industry. So if you go back, say, to 2013 and look at articles written by people like David Blanchett and Wade Pfau and those people, they were saying at the time, oh, well, looking at the evaluations, looks like it's only going to be a 3% rule. 10 years later, they were like, yeah, that was wrong. Let's not talk about it. Blanchett's now saying things like, yeah, we should really be talking about 5% spending. We should be talking about 5% spending.
I'm just trying to make this shift in my mind about, okay, if 5% works, what kind of conversations do we have in the financial independence community or even in personal finance communities at large? How does that impact those other conversations? And I don't really know, other than kind of like what you said. I think it's practically, it's the mindset of save. And then, like savings rates, higher the better, no matter what, during your accumulation phase, and then spend as least as you can in your decumulation phase. I guess if that's going to be your bar, as maybe behaviorally it kind of pans out that way for many. But looking at the numbers, I think two things. One, if you're saying a 5% safe withdrawal rate is very doable, then that changes a lot, because that means you can retire sooner, you don't need as much to retire
sooner, or do other things.
So we should just go back. Like there's if you're in a document, find this and then replace with this. Just go back and replace all 4% with 5%, and then does it still make sense? That's something I'm going to be looking forward to thinking through as I continue to read content and think through different things. Risk and decumulation phase or in retirement is definitely a fear that a lot of people have. And annuities are one way that some people can mitigate that downside risk. However, this conversation that you and I are having right now sort of competes with the conversation I just had with Stan the Annuity Man, which he made some good points. Stan the Annuity Man also said the same quote that Dr. Bill Bernstein said: when you've won the game, stop playing. Or if you've won the game, why are you still playing? Something to that effect. And while Stan talks about just get an annuity and cover your income floor, and then have, say, liability and I don't think he said risk. I don't know. I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically, have a portion of your portfolio in annuities, have the other portion in equities. The annuity serves as you're mitigating your downside risk for market return or market volatility. But you're saying that if you can reduce risk via other means, which is through risk parity, you may not need an annuity, or at least that would also address some of the downside risk factors of the market. So what are your thoughts on annuities, and does it have a role?
I like Stan a lot because he really makes a lot of sense with respect to annuities. And one of the most important things he says is if you are under 50, you should not be touching annuities. And the reason and how they fit in, how I fit them into portfolio ideas is remember that the payout of an annuity, I'm talking like a SPIA, a basic vanilla, is based largely on your age. And the older you get, the higher the payout is going to be. So when you're 50, the payout is only going to be like 3 or 4%, and it's not adjusted for inflation. When you get to age 70, even if you get a joint annuity, the payout is something like 7%, in which case it becomes a very useful tool. And I think around that time is when we plan to be looking at annuities to see whether it makes sense for us. And oddly enough, and this is, I think, something that the annuity industry certainly doesn't want to address, is what matters for you and whether annuity is going to be good for you is how long do you think you're going to live? Are you healthy? Does longevity run in your family? My father's 95 years old. The older you get, the more interesting and more useful it becomes. Because also your inflation risk goes down simply because you're not going to live as long. The problem with dealing with these early on, they're twofold. The people buy them too early, and then people get sold annuities as, oh, we'll create this annuity and it'll be there accumulating and you'll turn it on later. To me, that doesn't make any sense at all. You don't need to. Annuities aren't scarce. When you want one, there's going to be one available. And so it makes a whole lot more sense to me is to hold off on thinking about annuities until you're very much older, and then be looking at how healthy you are, what you and your spouse, and sort of what else you have going on there. Because using that as a supplement to Social Security to get you at some floor does make a lot of sense, particularly when they start having payouts that are in the 7 or 8% range. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when they're earlier. There's another interesting thought I always have about annuities, though, and this goes back to our early discussion. If you are spending like 3% or less of your portfolio, you might be better off just buying the annuity, because you could spend less money on that, get the same amount of money since you're not going to be spending it anyway. So I think annuities actually make more sense the lower your withdrawals are, percentage wise, because you could take only a piece of your portfolio that would cover all of your expenses, and then you don't need to worry about the rest of your portfolio. You can do whatever you want with it, because since you're not spending much money anyway, the annuity can take care of it. So I think these are interesting tools. I don't think that the financial services industry does you any favors in the way they recommend using them. I don't think they're being used in the right way, and the right way to use them for me is to wait until you're much older and then look at this as a supplemental thing you might want to look into at that point in time.
But you mentioned at some point in the future, you may consider, at least explore the option of an annuity. But you're also big into this risk parity portfolio management. I mean, you're clearly, if you were to Google risk parity, you come up. One, your podcast is named that. But second, you've got some material out there. So you do come up in the conversation. So you're a credible source, and perhaps even in your own portfolio, you're living that out and you're seeing things. You're getting data points that you're using to make your own personal financial decisions. Let's fast forward. How old are you right now?
I'll be 60 in October.
Okay. So let's say roughly 60. And maybe 70, you start looking at annuities, or at least you start opening that up. Well, you have 10 more years of data and living through your drawdown, if that's how you're getting your income right now. I'm assuming you're using your risk parity models in some way.
Yeah.
If you can get 5% safe withdrawal rate, why would you ever consider an annuity? And if you've got the track record to prove and be confident in that, but because an annuity, if you die, well, then you very likely will lose a portion of that rather than sending it on to generational wealth purposes.
Well, I guess the short answer is because I'm not greedy and I'm not trying to prove something with the portfolio, that it's serving a particular purpose right now that an annuity could not serve. I also need to think about my wife.
Mm-hmm.
She's perfectly capable of managing this. It's written down, so she's got it, in addition to be able to listen to me talk in 360 episodes of Risk Parity Radio. But there are other considerations at that point in time that I think I think the goal there needs to be more designed for who I become as a 70-year-old, and maybe I'm less capable of dealing with it for some reason. I hope one of the main purposes of my podcast was simply to lay this material down for our grown children, so they can use it. And I would hope that if I do become incapable, they'll be able to step in and manage the portfolio the way I would have. But there's a number of considerations as to why you might change what you're doing. And there are also some other issues that have to do with just the way spending works as you get older. And this is, one of the other myths or lies or things that people need to wrap their heads around, is that your spending is likely to decline as you get older in real terms. Your experience of inflation is likely to be 1 to 2% less than the CPI. So when you hear people shoving these giant inflation numbers in their never retirement calculator, you're doing it wrong. Yeah. You should be figuring on a lower inflation rate. Where this matters for me is that, one of the expenses we have right now is we support my parents. That expense is going to go away at some point because they are 95 and 90 right now. But one of the reasons that I took this course of action trying to maximize how much we could spend out of our portfolio is because there are things I need and want to spend money on now that need to be done now. And so that having that extra percent allows us to do those sorts of things that we wouldn't be able to do if we were to hamstrung ourselves and say we can only spend 3% of this portfolio because somebody said something about a CAPE ratio. So there are real world problems to be solved that I think need to be front and center, that we're not just doing this because it's intellectually interesting, even though I do find it intellectually interesting, but there's an ultimate purpose and an ultimate goal of being able to spend more money now, knowing that we're going to spend less money later anyway. I'm also a firm believer in giving away money while you're alive. My podcast supports a charity, and we're already giving our grown children parts of their inheritance. That doesn't need to be sitting in our accounts, not doing anything. It can grow very nicely in their Roth IRAs. You need to think about the life purposes of the money, and then back into what you're doing with it in terms of a portfolio, rather than thinking of it as like, well, I'm winning with this and I need to keep winning because there's nothing really to win.
Yeah, it's interesting, the different perspectives on the different age groups of people you have the conversations with, because you mentioned Bill Bernstein, and I don't even know if you know this, but he is the very next episode that's going to be released on my podcast. We just recorded last week, and it will be released on YouTube, this week, or I say last week if somebody's listening to this. And so it's great that you brought him up. But talking to him, talking to Stan, talking to Paul Merriman, talking to Jill Collins, talking to you, who are a few years more mature than I am, but it does represent I'm noticing a shift in mindset just based on age. So like we might, I say, and I'm like right on the cusp. I'm not like 25 or 35. I'm 46. So I'm kind of on that cusp, that transition over to maybe more mature wisdom of the next group. And I think I'm getting there quicker because I'm having these conversations. But my point is, when you first discover financial independence and you're gung-ho and you say never retire calculators, that's kind of funny. I don't think I've ever heard that phrase, but I get the point. you're trying to solve for every scenario and like win a game and, compete. And there's a gamesmanship to getting to the accumulation, but the natural transition is to shift to, okay, great. Money's money. It's a tool. What are we going to use this for now? And it needs to, so there's a transition from like the getting it, which is fun for most people, I think. Fun, exciting. Well, for some people it might be boring, but they get to that point and then they're like, okay, now what? Well, now you got it. Now you can focus more on life design and the next 40 years of your life. And how do you want to play that out? How are you going to not only use money, but think about money for that next 40 years, 50 years of your life? And so that's why I really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things to think about. And I mean, most people in the FI community do have like the natural savers gene. I call them ants, as ants and grasshoppers. Ants are the natural savers and grasshoppers are the natural spenders. That comes from one of Aesop's fables. But you do at some point, you really want to be an ant hopper at some point. that you can do both based on what your ultimate goals are in life, aside from the money, using the money as the tool and not the goal.
Mm-hmm. Frank, before we end this episode, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I will make a plug for the charity that my podcast supports. My podcast started as a hobby, but we support a charity that I'm on the board of. It's called the Father McKenna Center, and it serves hungry and homeless people in Washington, D.C. It's a small charity. We have lots and lots of volunteers, though. And if you're charitably inclined and like this message, I would invite anyone to, help us out, because this is also a good way to dispose of your money while you are alive and not wait until you are dead before donating.
All right, Frank, and I think that's representative of your giving spirit and your willingness to put good back out in the world. I've seen that through all of your Facebook comments. That's always added value to me as I'm going.
Some of those are awfully caustic, but I always tell people, I'm kind of like Shrek. Ogres have layers.
And I appreciate you taking the time today to talk to me about risk parity and how we can learn about risk parity and increase our safe withdrawal rate without too much more worry. So that was news to me, and I'm excited about looking into that a little bit more. And we'll have all the links or many links in the show notes. So if this information is interesting to you, scroll down, click a couple links, learn more. Thank you very much, Frank, for being here today.
You're quite welcome.
And thank you all for watching and listening.